In the heart of Renaissance Florence, a city bursting with genius, where artists sculpted gods and poets captured the soul of humanity, one man rose to power not with a brush, or a chisel, or a pen, but with fire. His name was Gerolamo Savonarola. For 4 years, he ruled the most beautiful city in Europe with the iron grip of religious absolutism. Under his command, priceless artworks were destroyed, music was silenced, and books were fed to flames. Children were turned into informants. Neighbors were taught to fear one another. Beauty, once Florence's proudest export, became a crime. But Savonarola was no ordinary tyrant. He wasn't a king, a soldier, or even a politician. He was a friar, a man of God, and his power came not from armies, but from words. His sermons, thunderous and terrifying, promised salvation through suffering, and painted a world on the edge of divine punishment. He claimed to speak with heaven's authority, and for a time, the people believed him. They believed so deeply, in fact, that they handed over their freedom willingly. This is not simply the story of a man's rise and fall. It is the story of how fear can be disguised as faith, how a civilization at its peak can unravel from within, and how even the most enlightened society is never more than one voice away from darkness. May the 23rd, 1498. The sun rose over the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, casting long shadows across ancient stone. A crowd gathered, not to hear a sermon, but to watch a burning. The man they had once knelt before, who had promised them a purified paradise, was now led to the scaffold in silence. The flames that consumed him were not only firewood and flesh, they were the dying breath of a movement that had turned the cradle of the Renaissance into a furnace of fanaticism. This is the story of Gerolamo Savonarola, prophet, tyrant, and a warning echoing across 5 centuries. At the close of the 15th century, Florence stood as the crown jewel of Europe. No other city burned so brightly with human brilliance. Towering cathedrals pierced the skyline, workshops buzzed with invention, and palaces glittered with the treasures of science, philosophy, and art. Florence wasn't just a city, it was an idea made real. It was the beating heart of the Renaissance. Here, artists turned marble into miracles. Michelangelo was still a young man, shaping stone with hands that seemed guided by something beyond human. Botticelli had painted Venus herself, rising from the sea, eternal and glowing on canvas. Leonardo da Vinci sketched machines that would not exist for centuries. Architects, poets, philosophers all found shelter and support within Florence's walls. Behind much of this wonder was one family, the Medici. The Medici were bankers extraordinarily wealthy, politically shrewd, and above all, patrons of genius. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, didn't just fund art, he cultivated a cultural revolution. His court was filled with thinkers and dreamers. Under his protection, dangerous ideas flourished: humanism, individualism, the celebration of man as something more than a sinner crawling toward salvation. The Renaissance in Florence celebrated the power of human reason, the beauty of the physical world, and the rediscovery of ancient wisdom. Pagan texts were translated and discussed openly. Public sculptures glorified the human body. Scholars questioned long-standing church doctrine. It was a time of bold thought and boundless creativity. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The same Florence that produced Botticelli's Angels also saw beggars lining the streets. While the elite debated Plato and paid poets with gold, ordinary citizens often struggled with hunger, disease, and rising taxes. The church, the institution meant to offer hope and stability, was rotting from within. The papacy had become a playground for the powerful. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, ruled the Vatican like a mafia boss. He sold church offices, flaunted his mistresses, and elevated his illegitimate children into positions of influence. To many Florentines, the Renaissance felt like a party they had not been invited to. They watched the elite drape themselves in silk while preaching virtue. They heard of ancient virtues but saw modern corruption. And all the while, plague and war still loomed just beyond the city walls. Beneath the gold leaf and painted ceilings, Florence was restless. Many longed for something more, something pure. They wanted a leader who could cleanse the city, restore spiritual order, and punish those who had twisted faith into fashion. They were not anti-intellectual or against beauty, but they feared that Florence had strayed too far, that the city's soul had been traded for spectacle. It was into this tension between glory and guilt, between idealism and decay, that a man named Gerolamo Savonarola arrived, and he did not come quietly. Gerolamo Savonarola was born in 1452 in Ferrara, a northern Italian city far removed from the grandeur of Florence. His family belonged to the minor nobility, comfortable, respected, but not powerful. From an early age, Savonarola stood apart. While other boys chased games or courtship, he buried himself in books. He read scripture obsessively, wrote poetry filled with moral fire, and filled his notebooks with laments for the decay of the world around him. Even as a teenager, he seemed old. What drove this intensity? Perhaps it was disillusionment. At 17, Savonarola fell in love with a young noblewoman. He proposed marriage, but her family rejected him. The pain, coupled with his growing frustration at the corruption he saw in both church and society, pushed him away from the world. In his early 20s, he left behind his family, his comforts, and his name. He walked to Bologna and entered the Dominican order. He did not seek prestige, only purification. But the man who joined the church was not yet the firebrand that would one day terrify Florence. At first, Savonarola struggled. His early sermons were poorly delivered. His voice was high-pitched and grating. He lacked charm, presence, and the kind of charisma that draws a crowd. By most accounts, he was awkward, rigid, even forgettable. But he did not give up. He studied relentlessly, memorized the Bible line by line, and became obsessed with the idea of divine justice. He came to believe that the world was not simply broken, it was doomed. And unless people repented, they would face God's wrath. These were not abstract ideas for him. They were terrifying, vivid, and immediate. In time, his failures shaped something more dangerous than talent, unshakable conviction. Savonarola believed he had been chosen, that his disappointments were not punishment, but preparation, that his voice, though once ignored, would one day become the instrument of divine reckoning. In 1490, his moment arrived. He was invited to return to Florence and preach at the convent of San Marco, a center of Dominican thought nestled in the heart of the city. When he took the pulpit this time, something had changed. His voice, once shrill, now boomed with force. His awkwardness had hardened into intensity, and his message, clear, terrifying, apocalyptic, found fertile ground in a city tired of both excess and emptiness. He warned of fire, of blood, of divine punishment for a culture drowning in pride and vanity. He described, in graphic detail, a coming storm that would cleanse Italy. And he claimed that these visions were not metaphor but messages directly from God. At first, many dismissed him as a fanatic. But as his predictions began to unfold with eerie accuracy, his influence grew. In 1494, just as he had warned, a foreign army invaded Italy. The people began to believe that Savonarola was not merely a preacher but a prophet. In the autumn of 1494, Savonarola's prophecy unfolded with terrifying precision. A massive army, led by Charles VIII of France, crossed the Alps and swept into Italy with little resistance. City after city fell. Nobles fled. The Medici Florence's ruling dynasty for decades collapsed almost overnight. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's weak and unpopular son, made a series of humiliating concessions to the French and was driven into exile by an angry mob. The power vacuum was immediate, and into that vacuum stepped Gerolamo Savonarola. He had not lifted a sword, commanded an army, or held a title. Yet he now stood as the most powerful man in Florence not because he seized control, but because the people gave it to him. They believed he had foreseen the invasion, and if he had predicted that, what else might he know? What other judgments from God might be on the way, Savonarola claimed that Florence had been spared destruction because it was destined to become a new Jerusalem, a holy city, purified of sin, chosen by God. He offered a vision of divine renewal, a republic ruled not by oligarchs or bankers, but by Christian virtue. The city embraced the idea. Florence restructured itself overnight. The old Medici regime was replaced by a new form of government, ostensibly republican. But under Savonarola's spiritual direction, though he held no official office, his influence was total. He advised lawmakers, drafted moral ordinances, and delivered sermons that were treated like state policy. He declared that Christ himself was now King of Florence, and he, Savonarola, was merely Christ's voice. What followed was unlike anything Renaissance Europe had ever seen. Gone were the celebrations, the carnivals, the art shows, and festivals. In their place came laws against gambling, blasphemy, homosexuality, and any expression of vanity. Taverns were shut down. Secular songs were banned. Women were urged to cover themselves modestly. Men were told to cut out luxury. The very pulse of Florence, its color, its passion, and its humanity began to fade. To enforce this new moral order, Savonarola turned to the city's youth. He organized children into roving patrols, sometimes called the Boys or the Purifiers. They were encouraged to spy on their neighbors, report their own families, and seize forbidden items from homes and shops. Some of these children were no older than 8. They moved through the streets with a zeal that only belief and fear can create. And then came the fires. In the center of the city, in the Piazza della Signoria, Savonarola ordered the creation of massive bonfires. He called them Bonfires of the Vanities. Citizens were commanded to bring anything deemed sinful or decadent makeup: mirrors, jewelry, fine clothes, playing cards, secular books, even musical instruments. These objects were thrown into the flames amid public prayers and hymns. Even Botticelli, the great painter of beauty and myth, is said to have tossed some of his own works into the fire. Florence, the city that had birthed the Renaissance, was now watching its own soul burn. But the fire was more than symbolic. It was control made visible. It was fear turned into ritual. It reminded the people that nothing, not art, not history, not love, was safe from judgment. And as Savonarola's sermons grew darker, the mood of Florence did too. He spoke now not of redemption, but of vengeance. He warned that those who resisted God's plan would be punished: heretics, sodomites, the greedy, the proud. All would fall. All must burn. He preached salvation, but built his power on fear. And though Florence appeared obedient, deep beneath the surface, the city was beginning to tremble. By 1496, Savonarola stood at the height of his power. He ruled Florence without crown or army, but with the absolute authority of a prophet. His word had become law. His vision had become doctrine. But the higher he rose, the more enemies he created. The most dangerous of them all sat in Rome. Pope Alexander Hijacked, once content to tolerate the friar's firebrand sermons, had begun to take notice. It was one thing to criticize corruption in general, it was another to point directly at the papacy. And Savonarola had done just that. In veiled language that left no doubt, he called the Pope a tyrant, a false shepherd, even the Antichrist. He accused the Vatican of selling grace like a merchant and warned that divine wrath would soon strike the heart of the Church itself. Alexander Hijacked was not a man known for patience. In 1497, he excommunicated Savonarola and placed the city of Florence under interdict of spiritual embargo. No mass, no sacraments, no weddings or baptisms. For a deeply religious population, it was a terrifying punishment. At first, Savonarola tried to hold the line. He claimed that the Pope's excommunication was invalid. He continued preaching, continued saying Mass, continued declaring himself God's messenger. But cracks began to form. Some of his allies stepped away. Others started to whisper. If Savonarola truly spoke for God, they asked, why had God allowed this? The streets grew quieter, the crowds thinner, doubt began to bloom. In desperation, Savonarola made a decision that would destroy him. He agreed to a public trial by fire. It was an ancient, barbaric ritual rare even in the Middle Ages. 2 men would walk through flames. Whoever emerged unharmed would be judged to speak for God. It was the kind of spectacle Florence hadn't seen in years, and it promised either divine vindication or total humiliation. On April 7th, 1498, thousands packed the Piazza della Signoria. A massive bonfire was built. The city held its breath. Savonarola did not walk himself. He sent a follower, another friar, to face the flames. His opponents did the same. But as the moment approached, arguments broke out. The fire wasn't hot enough. The conditions weren't fair. It started to rain. Hours passed. Tensions rose. And in the end, no one walked through the fire. The crowd that had come to see God's judgment instead saw cowardice, indecision, and political theater. They turned on Savonarola with stunning speed. The prophet who had once promised miracles had delivered nothing. The next morning, the tide had turned. People who had once sung hymns at his bonfires now threw stones at his door. Priests who had stood beside him in public now condemned him from the pulpit. His moral authority, once unquestioned, was gone. The city that had trembled at his voice began to remember what it had lost: its joy, its freedom, its art. On April 8th, a mob stormed the convent of San Marco. There was gunfire, blood in the streets. But Savonarola's defenders were outnumbered and unprepared. The friar who had once seemed untouchable was dragged from his cell broken, silent, and defeated. He had promised a holy city. Now, he would face a secular justice. Gerolamo Savonarola was no longer a prophet. He was a prisoner. Dragged from the convent where he once ruled like a king in robes, he was taken to the Palazzo Vecchio, Florence's town hall, now turned tribunal. There, he faced a different kind of inquisition. Not of the spirit, but of the flesh. Florence was not content with his arrest. The city demanded answers. And more than that, it demanded pain. His interrogators chose the strapado. It was a simple device. The prisoner's arms were bound behind his back and tied to a rope suspended from the ceiling. Then, he was hoisted into the air and dropped, jerked to a sudden stop that tore at the joints and wrenched the body in unnatural direction. It was not designed to kill, but to unmake. Savonarola had once preached about the purifying power of suffering. Now he lived it. Over the course of 2 brutal weeks, his body was broken, his shoulders were dislocated, his muscles shredded, infection set in. Between sessions, he was returned to a damp stone cell too small to lie down in. Fever came, delirium followed, and with it, his faith began to unravel. At first, he resisted. He clung to his visions, insisted they were true. But as the pain grew sharper and the silence of heaven more deafening, something inside him cracked. He began to confess. He admitted that his prophecies had been exaggerated, that his visions were not divine messages, but personal convictions, that he had manipulated fear to achieve his ends, that he had claimed to speak for God when, in truth, he had spoken for himself. Some believed these confessions were made only to end the torture. Others saw them as the final revelation of a man who, stripped of power and pride, had nothing left to hide. But even those words were not enough. The people of Florence had suffered too much, too many freedoms lost, too many loved ones exiled or executed, too many works of art turned to ash in the name of virtue. They wanted justice, and justice, in their eyes, meant fire. The city prepared for a spectacle. On May 23rd, 1498, a scaffold was raised in the Piazza della Signoria, the very same place where Savonarola had held his bonfires of the Vanities. Wood was piled high beneath a hanging platform. A gallows was built to ensure he would not die too quickly. Florence was not just killing a man, it was erasing a movement. At dawn, the crowd gathered. Tens of thousands poured into the square. Vendors sold wine and food. Children played in the streets. Women wore the makeup and jewelry they had once been forced to burn. It felt less like an execution and more like a carnival. Savonarola had to be carried to the scaffold. His body was too broken to stand. His robes were stripped. His voice, once thunderous, was a whisper no one could hear. He was not alone. 2 of his closest followers were executed beside him. All three were hanged until nearly dead, then revived, and finally lowered into the fire. As the flames rose, the cheers did too. Some said he tried to pray, others said he wept, but no miracle came, no voice from the heavens, no sign of divine rescue, only smoke. And then silence. To ensure no relics remained, the ashes were collected and thrown into the Arno River. Nothing would be left behind, not a bone, not a thread, not a monument. Florence wanted no martyr, but history would remember him anyway. The fire went out, the ashes cooled, and Florence exhaled. For the first time in 4 years, the city felt light again. The streets stirred with color and music. Taverns reopened. Artists who had hidden their brushes now returned to their studios. Scholars pulled forbidden books from hiding. Families, once divided by fear and denunciation, began the slow and painful process of reconciliation. It was as if a long, fevered dream had finally broken. But the damage could not be undone. Masterpieces had been destroyed. Friendships ruined. Children had learned to spy before they had learned to write. A city that had once celebrated the beauty of the human spirit had been taught to fear it. Florence survived, but it had been changed. The memory of Savonarola was not erased by fire. It lingered in sermons, in whispered stories, in the cracked silence of families who had turned against one another. For some, he remained a prophet who had spoken necessary truth. For others, he was a fanatic who nearly strangled the Renaissance in its cradle. His legacy reached far beyond the walls of Florence. Savonarola's fierce challenge to papal corruption helped pave the way for a much larger storm. Within 2 decades, Martin Luther would nail his theses to a church door in Wittenberg, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Like Savonarola, Luther questioned the morality of the Vatican, but unlike Savonarola, he would not burn, he would split the church in two. Savonarola had shown how easily faith could be weaponized, how quickly a call for purity could become a demand for obedience, how a population, even a sophisticated and cultured one, could surrender its liberty in the name of salvation. He also revealed something darker that people, once convinced they are on the side of God, can be made to do terrible things and feel righteous while doing them. History would repeat these patterns: Inquisition, Reformation, Revolution. The same techniques would surface again: public denunciation, cultural destruction, the use of youth as instruments of control, the promise of moral clarity in exchange for absolute power. And yet, Florence recovered, its Renaissance spirit scarred but unbroken returned. In the years after Savonarola's death, some of the greatest art in Western history would emerge: Michelangelo's David, Leonardo's Last Supper, Machiavelli's The Prince. The same city that had once burned its beauty now became a beacon for it once more. That may be the final irony and the final lesson. Savonarola tried to purify Florence by force, but beauty returned not through fear, but through freedom, not through sermons, but through sculpture, not by silencing the human voice, but by letting it sing again. His story is a warning, but also a testament. A warning that fear, once welcomed, does not leave quietly, that even the brightest civilizations can lose their way. But also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit to art, to thought, to joy, and to the truth that while fire may destroy, it cannot create. And in the end, what survives is not the flame, but what rises from its ashes.